Welcome back to session 2. We've got a lot more material to cover, but we're moving very quickly, quicker than maybe I expected. What I'd like to do to start the second session is to call on Molly Murphy, who is, as you know, a Democratic pollster, and ask her to talk about some of what she thought were key findings in the end of campaign and exit polls, and then maybe ask some of the other panelists to jump in and talk about what you found as extremely interesting about the way this election turned out.
We've talked about some of these things, so on those points I'll be more brief to just not rehash, but these are the things that I think are the most interesting, both in terms of what happened and then also as we reflect on future elections and what it means. I mean, I think the biggest takeaway is we're talking about this election as a realignment. And what does realignment mean? It means you've got voters who we assumed were bedrock Democratic voters who bled and moved to the right in profound ways. So, I mean, the biggest takeaways are young voters, particularly men, but also younger women did move towards Republicans. That sort of, gap that we hoped expanded potentially on both sides. I mean, our goal was to sort of move younger women, as we saw in 2022, more towards the vice president, to in some ways offset. We wanted to obviously blunt, but also offset what we saw as fairly likely younger men moving over more towards Republicans than they had in 2020. Both groups moved right, but it was certainly the swing we saw was because of men. The same is true when we talk about different communities of color, and that really is any racial or ethnic group. There are, we can talk about AAPI voters, Black voters, and Latino voters. Again, both genders moved, Black women barely, but everyone else moved a bit. And those men, whether they were Black men, AAPI, or Latino voters, shifted 20 points for Latino men, 26 points with Black men. Young voters, meaning under the age of 30, shifted 21 points towards Republicans. And I think that's, the question about this realignment. Was that a fixed moment in time? Is that something that is a reaction to this current environment, to the nature of the campaign and to Trump and what he brings? Or is this an indicator that these coalitions are never as firm as we want them to be, and campaigns should never fight the last war, but instead look at the sort of data and where people are now? But I think what I am the most struck by, and when people want to attribute a lot of different reasons for the outcome of this race, the biggest swings happened among lowest education attainment, lowest income voters, highest cost of living areas. And if you look at those, and those have the biggest shifts, and that's true if it's in California or New Jersey or Florida or a swing state, your highest, most expensive cost of living areas had the biggest swing to the right, and your lowest income, lowest education areas also had, voters had that biggest swing. It's hard to conclude that this election wasn't at least driven in large or almost entirely by people's economic lives. And I think that those are the things that I find to be in the data the most imperative that we understand moving forward. Is this temporal or is it permanent? The other piece that we've covered that I was, and I was preparing some of the things here in terms of what's interesting is whether we want to call it ticket splitters, I would say ticket splitted outcomes, whether it's the voter, that individual voter splitting their ticket, but the sort of split ticket outcome in a lot of these Senate and gubernatorial races. We saw more of that in Senate races this cycle than we had in the past two presidentials. In 2016 and in 2020, there was one Senate race that went for one party at the presidential level and the other party at the Senate level. That was Maine in 2020 for Susan Collins. And this cycle, you had Arizona, you had Nevada, you had Michigan, you had Wisconsin. Am I missing one?
North Carolina.
Yeah. North Carolina gubernatorial and New Hampshire on the other side in the gubernatorial voted for Vice President Harris and elected Kelly Ayotte as governor. And so when you dig into that and you look at what's underneath it, it very much was people voting for Trump and then leaving. They weren't necessarily saying, I like Trump, but I want to check on him, so I'm voting for the Democrat. And so moving forward, both parties, I think, need to understand what these coalitions are looking for, why they voted the way they do. But I think I also look at these and say, why was it Trump and no one else? Because that is less sustainable, I think, for Republicans moving forward, unless there is a fix to that. So I think those were the things I was most interested in and trends in this election.
I had two observations that I've learned sort of post-election. One is sort of I want us to almost all, let's not overdo the realignment talk. Because in some ways, this was a very simple election. You had an unpopular president. You had a vice president trying to succeed an unpopular president. That's never happened. The only vice president in any of our lifetimes to win the presidency, succeeding a living president, had a 63% approval rating on Election Day. Bill Clinton had a good job rating, but he didn't have a good personal rating. That was a drag. Nixon had his own drag. I mean, it is really hard to win an election as the incumbent party when the sitting president is at 40% approval, which he's been at for 2 straight years, and when nobody likes the economy, right? We can have a debate about, no, but the economy is healing. Doesn't matter. They don't like this economy.
Well, plus inflation is just a drag on an incumbent. Period,
Inflation
full stop.
destroyed 3 presidencies in the 70s.
Yeah.
Okay, Nixon survives Watergate if the economy's better. Ford wins if the economy's better. Carter wins re-election if the economy's better.
But it's inflation
Yeah.
specifically.
Specific,
in this
100%. But the second thing, and this is always my favorite part about a post-election, is the losing side suddenly shares memos that they never would have shared with you. And I got one from a
Molly brought some today. But
right.
Sure your pamphlet's on the way out.
A strategist for a Biden super PAC circa 2022 sent me a polling memo that he had sent to the campaign. And there was a single, he wanted me to note a single observation that he had made at the end. And it was having to do with the Latino vote. And what was interesting, they were asking all sorts of questions, and they were testing the democracy question. And one of the things that popped out to this source of mine, and he put it in his memo and he circled it to make sure I didn't miss it, was that Hispanics believed in a strong presidency. They were more open to a strong presidency. And in fact, were more, so this idea of the authoritarianism and this and that. And there was another aspect to it. The democracy message really didn't ring true with Latino voters, especially if they're first or second gen. Because first, you want to see a democracy crumbling? Let me introduce you to El Salvador. You want to see a democracy that doesn't work? Let me introduce you to Venezuela. And so it was one of those things that the Hispanic voters want a strong presidency, and they were more open to it, which was sort of this, at the time, he was right, like Trump may make more inroads here than you think. And then the other aspect of Latino voters is that the Trump campaign targeted them on the same issues they were targeting working class white voters. Mm-hmm. And the Harris campaign targeted them as a community of color. And that's where I think the disconnect has sort of, and it's sort of like, going forward, I think it's pretty clear class is the big divide in American politics, not identity. And I think I think both parties are sort of now get that in many ways, and I suspect a different sort of democratic messaging in the next 4 years because of that.
I'm sorry, Mel. Molly, go ahead.
I was just wondering, I'd love to hear from Molly and Anita about, given that this was showing up in all of the crosstabs of the public polling and we'd seen it start to happen in 2022, to what extent was the alarm being sounded within the campaign? Because the public message was a lot of denial that this was happening and an insistence that these groups were all going to come home in the final vote.
I mean, I don't know that I think we, even in our public comments, acknowledged that we saw it. We obviously sort of had hope and optimism that they would come back, but we saw it the whole time. I mean, if you look at the way we spent our resources heavily on digital, for instance, it's to reach those voters who are not consuming traditional media, broadcast television, that sort of thing. I think we made a lot of strategic decisions and spending decisions to try to reach those voters. One, it's hard to reach them, and so finding them where they are was a big imperative. But it was I can't overstate how important those groups were and how forefront they were in, all of the analysis and all the polling and all the poll briefings and all the paid communication. And I assume that was true at Future Forward based on everything I know about what you all did.
Totally true about Future Forward. And when Molly talks about this, and this was true for the Biden campaign as well as the Harris campaign. So this was not something we weren't tracking, it was something that people were singularly focused on. And certainly, just from a Future Forward perspective, a huge number of resources there at the end, throughout the campaign, targeted very much towards those communities, and with an economic message.
So,
Was there, sorry, one more thing. Was there a discussion of getting the vice president to lean more overtly into the historic nature of her candidacy? Because she was very aggressive about sort of downplaying that. Was there a feeling that it would backfire?
I wasn't part of conversations, should she or shouldn't she, because I do think actually that came from her, was she wanted to introduce herself to voters. And I also think probably we never really had discussions about this because, one, I think identity politics don't drive votes. So the historic nature of her candidacy, I don't think was going to be the reason someone went from sitting on the fence to voting for her. It may be the reason that somebody voting for her feels even more excited about doing so. I think the other piece was, though, that these voters were telling us, they tell us in how they voted, which was not for us, but they were telling us all along, I am unhappy, my life is hard, everything is too expensive. The idea that they would be like, but I love that she'll be the first is just not a conclusion those voters are going to make. So, I mean, it almost, I mean, she did avoid it. I don't know if it would, I don't know that I would say so tactically avoid it because one doesn't equal two, but it just would have completely missed the mark in terms of meeting people where they were. Yeah.
Of all the great lines that Bill Clinton has gotten off over the years, my favorite that I come back to time and time again is in 1992 when he was being pursued over the Vietnam draft dodging, Jennifer Flowers. He had this great riff. He said, voters care. He said, the Republicans care more about my past than about your future. And he made it about the voters. He said, the other guys care more about my past than your future. Always made it about them, the voters, because this is a selfie. Voters care about number one. They're in it for themselves. What have you done for me? This is not JFK. Ask not, man. Voters want to know, like, what are you doing for me, politician? And that to me was, you can boil the Trump's victory down to just that fact. The voters looked around and said, this isn't working for me. And the other guy was better. And that's why I'm voting for the other guy. It's just not that much more complicated than that. And Chuck, on the inflation thing, it's funny when I actually caught Clinton in North Carolina for a day and a half, and he was in pretty small towns. And there was one stop, it was Wilson, North Carolina, where, as Clintons want to do, he occasionally blurts out the truth. And he said, I saw what happened to Jimmy Carter on inflation. I can't quite do it justice, but he mentioned Carter in 1980, and he was trying to do the sort of like.
He's stuck on that 1980 election because the only one he ever lost. So.
Has never forgotten or forgiven Jimmy Carter.
Never
for that.
forgiven Carter.
Exactly. They sent those refugees to Fort Chaffee. I couldn't come back. No, but he couldn't help himself because he was trying to do the explainer in chief. This is why inflation was so bad globally. The supply chains, you see, it really hurt after COVID, and that's why we all paid a price for it. And grocery consolidation and he was brilliant at it. But then he just blurts out, I saw what happened in '80 with Carter, and it was almost like, he just said it out loud.
Hey, Anita, address this.
Inflation's a killer.
I heard President Biden sort of lament that he didn't sign the checks.
Yes.
I thought that was an interesting blurt.
That came up with voters so much, right?
Talk about the accidental speaking the truth. He goes, I guess I should have signed the damn check.
Yes.
What is he? Is he been muttering about that a little bit?
I haven't been there for that, Chuck.
Fair.
So.
Okay. So, Alex, I want to bring you in on this because, as Molly said at the outset of this conversation, made inroads with, Hispanics, with blacks, particularly black males, with young men in general. Not an accident, because you guys had a very conscious social media, podcast, direct to live streaming strategy to reach those audiences. Talk about what that strategy was and what was different about it.
Yeah, we knew from the beginning that we had to assemble a pretty diverse coalition, again, of some voters who don't traditionally vote for Republicans, and obviously we've seen the effects of that down ballot. But that includes libertarians, right? And that's why the president made a conscious decision to go to the National Libertarian Convention, which I can tell you is kind of a wild affair.
No.
That's on C-SPAN at night. Yeah,
Exactly.
After dark.
Exactly. The president loves going to UFC fights, but there's a reason why we went to so many, right? To appeal to younger men, Hispanic men, black men. Doing a rally in the Bronx. It's not because we thought we were going to win the Bronx, but it was to message to those particular voters, no tax on tips, something that the president thought of, hey, this would help some of the wage earners that are in, across the country, but particularly in a state like Nevada. And so you start to do these things and they have a cumulative effect and a cumulative message to different segments of voters. I mean, we did a lot of work with the Mormon community in Arizona and Nevada, pretty sizable portion of the electorate. And so, we're seeing the results of that borne out, in Clark County, for example, which is a third, Clark County, Nevada, third Hispanic. That went from a +9 Biden county to a +3 Harris, right? We had a 6-point shift there, and that's 70% of the state's population there. Some other counties, Jefferson County, Georgia, 51% African American. President Trump won that county by 1 point when it was won by Biden by 7 points. So, we're seeing all of those effects add up. Obviously, the podcast you mentioned, Joe Rogan, this non-traditional forms of media that younger voters gravitate towards and get their media from. Elon Musk's support, reaching different voters. And we had an entire field program that was simply geared towards going after low propensity, Trump-leaning voters. Maybe they didn't participate in the last primary. Maybe they didn't vote in 2020, but they voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And so we had a conscious decision that we developed during the Iowa caucuses to implement a 10 for Trump program where, in traditional campaigns, and we took a lot of flack for this because, a lot of people said, well, you don't have thousands of organizers or tens of thousands of organizers across the country. You don't have thousands of offices, all of which take a tremendous amount of resources, staff, and time. But, what we did have and what Donald Trump is unique in his candidacy is an incredibly motivated group of volunteers who are willing to go out and call or meet 10 strangers and convince them to go to the polls or even bring them to the polls on election day or, again, as we mentioned before, to vote early. Get these people to return their ballots. So we call it the 10 for Trump program, and it was a way to create a bite-sized action for our most engaged and passionate supporters.
And the Harris campaign tried to do some of those same exact things, but they didn't have the same exact effect, right? So she went on podcasts. Notably, she went on the Call Her Daddy podcast to try and get to the low propensity voters because they also determined that they needed to try and pull in some of those people. She also tried to create some of those moments in the campaign. Think back to Houston when she had the Beyonce rally, the reproductive freedom. It was a reproductive freedom event is what they called it, abortion rights. She also had the democracy speech on the ellipse at the White House on the lawn, and it just in the end didn't end up having the same exact effect, I think, as when Trump's team ended up doing those things. We could also talk about the message of democracy as the close when we're talking about the economy, whether she should have been focused more on the economy. But when it comes to the gender gap specifically, and we talk about exit polling, one thing that stood out to me is that in exit polling by the networks, that there was a plus 12 for Trump, so that was wider than the margin for Biden. He did better with men. And then among women, it was plus 8 for Harris. But Biden won women by 15 points. So for all the focus on women and abortion rights, which had always been Vice President Harris's strategy, right, because of 2022 and the fact that she had led on the issue and the fact that it had done so well, even in a place like Kansas when abortion rights were on the ballot. The Harris team thought that they could really turn out women with this issue, including not just the suburban women, but including Republican women would come out on this issue, and you just didn't see that bear out in the election the way that her team thought that it would. And I do think that this largely goes back to the economic question. Voters were consistently saying in poll after poll after poll that the economy and inflation were their number one issue, not democracy, not abortion rights, not unity, not these other messages. And yet there was a consistent focus towards the end on many of those issues rather than every single day just driving home the economic message.
Hey, I got a question for Molly, because I think Trump should get more credit for inoculating himself on abortion.
Yeah.
And I don't think, like, what he did in Florida was when he was like, I don't like this. I don't want to, and then he gets pressure to vote for it, but he had to be dragged to it. And I'm curious, like, here's a counterfactual we don't know, Francesca, which is if he had the Ron DeSantis position on abortion, does abortion rise up in importance? And does the gender, I mean, how much did Trump's ability to inoculate himself on this issue sort of make it harder for you to create a gender gap?
So the gender gap, I'm trying to figure out which part to start on first. I will talk about the abortion part first, then I'll talk about sort of the impact that I think it had on the gender gap. Going into this race early on, even before the Florida remarks, Trump is masterful at being impossible to pin down on things. We did very early research, very early in early 2023, coming out of the midterms on what is his brand relative to abortion. What do people think will happen if he's president on the issue of abortion? How afraid of Trump being president are abortion voters. And what we found very early is that, especially for the voters we needed to win, the people who were concerned about abortion, those abortion voters, they're very scared of Trump, right? Like, if you are concerned about that issue, you have made up your mind. But for voters who could vote on the issue, for voters that it mattered if they felt like it was truly threatened, they had no memory, and they're not, civics is not front of mind for a lot of these voters who also care about inflation, and they also care about, the border. They care about a lot of issues. They did not know, they did not remember his role in the Dobbs decision. They don't think about Supreme Court nominees and litmus tests or any of those things.
It's such a big ask of the electorate,
It's
right?
huge.
Yeah.
It's and in a way that I hold no judgment. That is just a fact. If you barely follow politics, like, why would you think about that? And Dobbs happened not when Trump was president. Not that they think Biden caused it, but they
Didn't
just
some
didn't-
voters think that?
Some I think that was
Right,
massively overplayed. I never saw anyone say they thought Joe Biden took us back on abortion rights. That was not a perception that we had to address. But they didn't really think that he had a role in it. They didn't think he cared about the issue. They thought maybe he was against abortion, but that is not what got him out of bed every morning. And so that was our challenge, was doing a little bit of connecting the dots, because you got to give people the reason that they want to listen to you, and then showing them what he was capable of doing through his prior actions, and that this wasn't a vote just to punish him for Dobbs, but to guard against whatever could come in a second term. That's a lot. It's a lot to give voters. Ultimately, those numbers did not shift much from where he started out in terms of metrics of how concerned are you that he's going to try to ban abortion or restrict abortion or sign an abortion ban. They stayed below the numbers we needed, even among women voters. And I think some of it is his own actions and what he was able to do to be slippery on it. I think it worked well against Republicans in some of the Senate states where they were much more ideological on it, and you had tape and you were able to make a clearer, more concise argument on it. How do I think it contributed to the gender gap? In the counterfactual where he had that position, I do think we do better with women. But I still think that what we learned in this election is the types of new voters who showed up, the people who weren't there in the midterms, the people who showed up to vote on abortion in the midterms still voted against Donald Trump. But there is that new crop of voters. They didn't care about abortion in 2022 or else they would have voted. They were motivated by economic issues, and I just think that was our gender gap problem much more so than
Yeah, the
abortion.
Republicans now do better in larger turnout elections, which is the opposite of what it was 10 years ago. You know, I also think that Trump was inoculated, Chuck, to borrow your phrase, in part just by his character. It's hard to sell him as like a stern, judgmental Jerry Falwell type figure. He's not, right? He's a celebrity from TV who everybody knows as kind of a playboy over the years. I can't remember who wrote this, but it was really insightful that one of the secrets to the success of sort of right-wing populists around the world, whether it's Boris Johnson, Berlusconi, or Trump, is they all evade the perception of being sort of a starchy, far-right, down-the-line conservatives because their personal lives are so florid, right? Like, nobody's going to say, like, those guys are somehow going to be, like, judgmental on cultural issues because their own lives that they've led are obviously not. And so he benefits in some ways with the voters from being the opposite of kind of the Christian coalition, a button-down type. It's
Well,
like,
it sounds like anybody can join the Trump campaign. He doesn't judge you, right? And there's this mindset of, right, Republicans aren't telling you how to. It used to be the Republicans were telling you how to
Yes.
live, and the Democrats were the ones who are not going to tell you how to live. And now somehow the roles got flipped,
Right.
where the Democrats are telling you how to speak, what you should say in public,
or what straw to
yeah,
use.
and it's the Republicans are like, hey, come on in. We're not going to judge.
I think the same dynamic with the podcast all kind of comes together on the issue of the sort of fascism argument that was made. Like, he'll go on these podcasts and he'll talk about sports and he'll be like a regular guy, and people are like, this isn't Hitler. And so it just doesn't quite land in the same way, and it sort of inoculates him from some of that like dark, brooded, dark language that you heard.
What proportion of the paid advertising was about abortion?
The figure I saw was 22%. Somebody will fact check me on that on the campaign, but I think it was around 22% all in, on the Harris on the Harris.
But I want to bring up that point you just made, because the Senate folks made this point strong, right? Which is the videotape on the Republican candidates was very much more strident on the issue.
Yes.
And it was constant in the TV ads, which is why it was effective. The problem, but I'd even go back with Trump, all the previous tape on him on abortion's all over the place, too. So it's like you couldn't go to the videotape. So so I take your point that he inoculated himself
Yeah, and
basically the minute he came down the escalator.
I do also think to the strategy of the Trump campaign. So he, said what he said in Florida. He, kind of says everything on it. They were in mailboxes talking to some of these low propensity women who may decide to vote on abortion, inoculating on his position. So it wasn't just what he did out on the stump. They put dollars behind it. And we didn't
the
see
mail
it.
advantage.
People don't talk. I mean, we
Yeah.
saw it, but
I've heard this. Did they do a ton more direct mail than you guys did?
significantly.
Yeah.
That's what I've heard.
Well, but Brendan, it raises an interesting question about whether the abortion issue cut more in House and Senate races than it did in the presidential race. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our guys have been pretty out there on some of this for, I don't know, years and years and years. And it kind of finally caught up to bite them. And they've taken votes on these things in ways that Donald Trump has never taken votes on them. You'll have people tell you that it matters less in places where abortion is not necessarily at risk, in blue states. But I don't know that that's. I think if you're still in New York and you're, have a voting record of voting against abortion rights, that's going to sting. And yeah.
Historically, money has been a real huge issue in presidential campaigns and especially lower level campaigns. But in this election, it didn't seem to be that much of an issue because the Trump campaign was outspent. What's happened here? Has this been a big change?
Trump has been outspent in all of his campaigns.
Yes.
I was gonna say.
Yeah.
John Kerry outspent George W. Bush.
Yeah, but we're talking about
No,
of $1 billion.
Substantial
I think
numbers,
president.
yeah.
I think the higher the race, right, the more
The inverse.
right.
Yeah.
It is right. Money matters more in a
Right.
House race than it
Right.
does in a president.
Right.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And we saw that down ballot where Democrats significantly outraised Republicans and outperformed in a lot of races Republicans thought we were going to win. We didn't because Democrats outraised. And then at the top of the ticket, I don't know how much money you can spend to try to redefine Donald Trump in a way that he isn't already defined. So,
The earned media value of
Yeah.
going to McDonald's and doing a shift there was, just absolutely incredible. We're talking hundreds of millions of
And
dollars.
it breaks through. It's not just
Right.
political people consuming
Yeah.
it. It's
Right.
normies, right?
But then that's the clip. That doesn't include the clips on TikTok and Instagram and everything else.
But you also didn't have to spend as much because you were outsourcing so much of the ground game, right,
That's true.
to other groups, and that's what a lot of the Harris campaign money went to. Although, obviously, as you guys have come under scrutiny for, it went to a lot of other things as well. But the ground game was a significant part of that, right?
That's exactly right. And in light of a new FEC decision that allows campaigns to coordinate ground efforts only with outside groups, we took full advantage of that.
Look, I'll admit I was a skeptic because John Kerry tried that strategy and it blew up in his face.
Yep.
And I think a lot of
also tried
right,
that
and it blew up in Ron. It's
Mm-hmm.
interesting. This is the first time it worked, but it sounds like the ability to coordinate better makes the strategy more of a realistic strategy now.
That's right. Divide and conquer. Obviously, again, you only have a certain amount of dollars and a certain segment of the voters. Again, we were primarily going after low propensity voters, and so being able to contact them and use outside groups to do so when they had, obviously much easier ability to raise money was just a better use of our limited resources.
But the elephant in this room is Elon Musk. So what difference did it make that he shows up and opens up the bank vault?
I think the results bear out exactly.
But what did that allow you to do that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise?
Well, I think it was a value add, tremendously helpful in states like Pennsylvania, where essentially he lived for the last 45 days of the election. I think also it helped appeal to, again, that sense that we've got energy behind us. We've got non-traditional major supporters like Elon, like Joe Rogan, and others. And certainly he put his personal fortune on the line. I don't have exact numbers from them in terms of vote counts but they knocked on an incredible amount of doors that we would not have otherwise reached. Now, we also had our own internal field program called Trump Force 47 that we branded and that we used to great effect. But, a lot of what the outside efforts were doing were additive, right? The repeated engagements, again, with those low propensity voters.
The Ron DeSantis ground game turned out to be really effective. It just that it didn't happen until it was for a candidate besides Ron DeSantis. That's a bit of an inside joke. The folks that did the Elon Musk ground game with all of his money were two of the folks who were very involved in the DeSantis campaign, such as it was, and they put a lot of stock into their ground game, which didn't cut much ice for DeSantis, but obviously helped the cause for Donald Trump.
That's right.
Ron DeSantis did come in second in Iowa when the polls had him coming in third, so may have helped a little bit.
Small things.
Two points.
Yeah, there you
2
go.
points
Small
between.
But
Isn't one of the
Like a
downsides,
17,
though,
19,
of doing that, not that you guys need to worry about that again, because Donald Trump isn't going to run for president again, though, but
we don't
those
think.
groups own those data. Well, he said that. His
word is
but unless
gold,
Congress
so,
does
yeah.
something. But isn't one of the downsides of that, the major downside, that those groups then own all of that data? You still, it sound like, have no insight into the people they actually ended up contacting. It's not then as if when you're heading into the midterms or someone else wants to run in 2028, it's not as if J.D. Vance, for instance, has ownership of that data in a way that the Republican Party can put it to work in the same exact way that Democrats send all of that data back to a central place.
Well, and I know the Democrats have this. I don't know what their equivalent is, but they have what's essentially a data trust, a nonprofit that will house that data. And so we are, again, in light of that FEC decision, we are able to take a lot of those targets, a lot of that data, and then house it at a nonprofit entity.
Can we now say there are no federal election laws, campaign money anymore? I'm sorry, it just isn't. Like it is, you can now raise $1 million per person for a campaign. It used to be there was a max amount of money that they could give to collective federal races, right? It's the Wild West, no? Aren't we a pre-Watergate type of financing these days? Pretty
Yeah,
close?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Without the suitcases, we got the money, but not the suitcases.
Well, they're not suitcases anymore, they're crypto.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not.
It's much lighter.
Chuck, the only people who aren't allowed to raise that kind of money are the two political parties,
Yeah,
okay?
exactly. Which is-
Yeah,
that's-
Okay? So,
Look, Mitch McConnell was
problem.
right. McCain-Feingold was a disaster for the two political parties.
Yeah, yeah.
Going back to Brandon's point about the money, I do think that there's evidence it may have been decisive down ballot. There was a statistic that came out yesterday that of the 60-odd House races that were decided by 5 points or less, Democrats won 43 of them.
Wow.
And that's how they almost won the
That's a
House.
fun counterfactual for Brendan Buck. If Kevin McCarthy had not been ousted, and Kevin's fundraising prowess and all of his connections, which were obviously more significant than Mike Johnson's, would Kevin McCarthy have kept the bigger House majority?
Well, you joke, but like,
Kevin.
there is
You're
also a
Kevin's.
potential like long-term maybe downside with this new working class
Yeah.
coalition for Republicans is like we're just kind of getting outraised because our voters
Yeah.
have fewer resources to
Right.
devote to it. And Democrats have a very good culture of, so, if, your average Republican, your average Democrat sees something on MSNBC and gets fired up, they may go
Yes.
to Act Blue and make a contribution. The average Republican is going to see something on Fox and get upset, and they're just going to post on Facebook.
Yes.
And that has value too, but not in the same way.
Yeah.
But we said the governing, you innovate, so this feels like your moment
Right.
for you guys to capitalize on Fox News hits or whatever we do.
Well, it's a matter of,
Yeah.
to just do the demographics have the same resources that you need.
Well, but let's pick up there, Brendan. I'll start with you, but others should join in and talk about what the meaning of the outcome of the race for control of the House in the Senate is. I mean, it was a sweep for Republicans, but barely. 5 House seat majority, which is nothing. Control of the Senate, but mostly because you now have seats in Ohio and West Virginia and Montana that you probably should have had all along anyway. What does that tell us about where the country is? What does it tell us about how Washington's going to work?
I don't know that it tells us a whole lot. Like I said, we won the House aggregate vote by 3%, and we have 220 seats. In 2016, we won the House aggregate vote by 1% and had like 240 something. So it really just comes down to districts, and redistricting has not been very favorable to Republicans of late, and it was very favorable for a long time. What does it mean for governing? It's not only do we not have 220 seats, we're going to have 217 seats for much of the very beginning.
4 months for a year.
It's going to be,
What happens when somebody falls off a roof while cleaning their gutters?
there are going to be days necessarily that there are more Democrats there than there are Republicans. Attendance is just an issue that you always have to monitor. That said, I think they're going to be relatively productive because they have to be. We now live in this world where every president gets elected, and basically every president since Clinton has had unified government in the start, and they live like they're dying. They spend those 2 years doing everything they possibly can because they know they're about to lose in the midterms. And if you're Republicans with a 5-seat majority, you get pretty sure you're going to lose in the midterms. So you do everything you possibly can right now. They are setting up a procedure with I won't get into reconciliation, but using a budget procedure where they can at least get 2 bites of an apple at passing things without the Senate filibuster. And they're probably going to get their tax bill done. They're probably going to get something on immigration and energy done. And the narrow margin is going to matter less than it did the last couple of years when they had a narrow margin, because Donald Trump is not going to allow them to fail. In 2017, we tried to do health care in the beginning, and we fell flat on our face. And you had a bunch of Republicans, even like really conservative ones, who voted against it, and Donald Trump was sort of unable to bring them along. That's not going to happen this time. And we ended up getting tax reform done because we had to, out of pure political necessity. Like if we had failed on that after failing on health care, we just couldn't allow it. So they're going to figure out a way to do it because they have to, but they also could get it done because they know this is their only window to do things. I've made that sound a little simpler than it is. It's going to be complicated with a narrow majority there, but I do think they're going to operate a lot more efficiently than they did in the past. But there are going to be a lot of moments also of bipartisanship that's going to be necessitated by the fact that Republicans won't vote for a lot of things that you can't do out of reconciliation. They're going to have to fund the government in March. There's no way Republicans can fund the government on their own. They don't like to vote for that. So Democrats are going to have to come in and bail them out, and what kind of negotiation that looks like. They're going to have to do the debt limit again this summer. Republicans can't vote to increase the debt limit on their own. So there's going to be opportunities for Democrats to come along, and I'll be very curious to see what Mike Johnson's standing in the conference is when one of the very first things he does is turn to Hakeem Jeffries and say, I need you to bail me out on this next vote.
Isn't this going to be a mirror image of the first 2 years of Biden? This narrow Senate, it was a narrow Senate majority where essentially it's just going to be this win big giant bill. I take your point that Trump will have a lot of influence, but there'll be somebody who gets the Joe Manchin disease and says, "Ooh, look at me, I can have leverage." Members of Congress love to be when they get to know they get to have leverage. But it's really almost like a mirror image of the first 2 years of Biden, no?
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know that they'll really care too much whether what they're doing is popular. I think that they, and I guess I would argue that is part of the reason why we're all, everything that we're talking about today was the agenda was not as popular as Democrats had hoped it would be. But they probably, again, will be much more motivated by putting big points on the board. I don't know that they've really defined what the other big package is, and that's the other thing. So I come
We're going to pass something.
I come from the John Boehner, Paul Ryan era where we were putting out our agendas and kind of like outlined before the election, here's what we're going to do if we win, and they haven't done that. And so there's this like vague, we're going to do a big reconciliation package on energy and immigration, but I don't really know what else, and I don't really know what that means either.
I think they have concepts of a
Exactly.
Nice.
Concepts of a plan.
But wait, you said they're going to get something done on immigration. What?
Funding for
yeah.
immigration. So the enforcement measures that Donald Trump has in mind, you can't, do without resources to do them.
So you're not talking about an overhaul reform?
No, there's no chance that they,
Yeah.
and so I don't mean to get too in the weeds on this, but the tool they're going to use, reconciliation, that allows you to get outside of the Senate filibuster, can only really be used with fiscal measures. You can't do policy changes. And so they'll find some way to make funding for immigration enforcement, whether that's more money for judges or more money for detention centers or whatever, more money for border agents. They'll find some way to make that fit within reconciliation where they can do the enforcement piece. He can't do like remain in Mexico or any kind of policy like that on immigration. This is just about getting the resources they need. Because to my point, if you just try to do this through your normal funding process, where Republicans will never be able to vote to fund the full government, it'll get blocked in the Senate, and they would have to do it in a bipartisan way. And of course, Democrats aren't going to give money for that.
I don't want to get too wonky here, and I want Alex to, because you did congressional relations in the Trump White House for 4 years. But is Donald Trump going to do tariffs by executive order or by legislation?
Oh, man. I want to take tariffs, though, after you.
I assume he's going to do it by executive order. I mean, that's the authority that he has.
But he can't score the revenue as...
You make a very good point. So one of the other things that they're wrestling with is doing taxes is really expensive. And is there a way to capture that revenue and score it? So another thing of reconciliation is you have to set sort of fiscal targets that you have to stay within. If you want to do full extension of the tax laws that are expiring, it's like $4 or $5 trillion. And you have to pass a budget that says you're going to do that. That's not an easy vote. I'm going to pass a budget that's going to add $4 or $5 trillion to the deficit. So they are going to be looking for ways to reduce that number. One way that is being floated is, can you try to get the Congressional Budget Office to score the revenue that Donald Trump would be bringing in by doing tariffs? Currently, you don't get credit for that. You don't get budget credit for something the president just sort of does because it's not in the bill. Now, they could direct the Congressional Budget Office to do whatever they want. Or they can just simply ignore it and say, he did this over here. We're gonna count this. Don't worry about it. It's not really $4 trillion. There's lots of ways they can go about this. I don't think Republicans want to vote to put in statute tariffs. But I do think Donald Trump is very serious about using them. I do think that he actually very firmly believes that like China will pay the bill instead of American consumers.
What steps does the Democratic Party need to consider to get back on track in 26 and 28? Or is it really more of a matter that in today's contemporary politics, there's nothing wrong with the Democratic Party that the Republican Party can't fix?
Well, there is a truth to the latter part, I think. I do think that we are in a period of change elections that is for reasons bigger than one party's brand or the other, but rather a disconnect between people and institutions and the people who represent them. And so I think that to fix the problem, Democrats and institutions broadly need to work on regaining public trust. And so I do think that that's important. I think that structurally, the move of working class voters and, you know, sort of class divide we see emerge is going, if it continues, will create an unfixable structural disadvantage for Democrats. And so that has to stop, that has to be fixed. And so I think that there are lots of things you can look at. Right now, we're in an inflationary environment, and it's very cost-driven. But I think there are other culture conversations that we are on the losing end of. There's broader brand perceptions that we as a party tell people how to talk, how to think, that I don't think were driving factors in how people voted in this election, but can be quite pernicious and create bigger distance. If the premise of ever getting elected is that you can convince someone that you understand their life, you respect them and the work and the challenges, that they are going through in their lives, you can't do that when you're perceived as someone who talks down and preaches to them. And so I think those can be pernicious problems, even if they're not vote driving. At the same time, I do think that the party's brands are similarly deeply flawed and problematic, and we are likely to swing back and forth. And I also think that doesn't just exist in government and in politics. It is media, it is corporations, it is across the board. The numbers on institutions over the last 20 to 30 years have just fallen off a cliff. And so some of these are byproducts of a larger dissatisfaction that I think we can say it is unique to one party because one party lost an election, or we could widen the aperture and see that that is just a symptom of a much bigger problem.
Alex, man, I thought you were going to talk about Congress and tariffs. That's why I held back. But when it comes to the Democratic Party and what the party needs to do, just based on my conversations with voters and what I saw from the Harris campaign, because there wasn't the Democratic primary, Democrats didn't go into the battleground states or any of the other states early on and really have the conversations in that way. And certainly President Biden, campaigned for re-election. That's not what I mean, but it wasn't the same exact conversation that was taking place among Republicans where people were really engaged because there wasn't the primary. So there's a lot of work to be done there. But the thing that I consistently heard from voters was that they were frustrated with the idea that they felt, particularly in communities of color, the idea that Democrats only came around when it was an election year and it was time for their vote, and that there wasn't this consistent years-long conversation in their communities about how they were feeling, what they wanted to change. And I heard this in barber shops. I heard this at churches. I heard this from voters from all walks of life. And so it seems to me, coming out of this election, that as Democrats rebuild, that there is, even within the Democratic Party, conversations that are going to have to take place as they rebuild.
I do want to give credit to Democrats for at least, it seems at this point, like taking seriously and trying to look inward and see if they need to. My party has not done a very good job of learning lessons or even trying to. We put together in, I guess it was 2012, the sort of blueprint for coming back and completely ignored every part of it. I don't know
No, Trump's finally figured out how to win Hispanic voters.
I know. That's true. And so I don't know how long Democrats will be engaged in this process, but some recognition that sort of identity groups in DC shouldn't be calling all of your shots, and like realizing that like being the language police turns off a lot of voters, I think is useful. We'll see if it sticks, but I do want to commend them for at least like having that conversation.
Can I just make a
I would help with
notation?
that comment.
If you look at the last 3 Democratic nominees for president, they were all sort of anointed, meaning, it didn't feel like they came from the voters. I'm not saying that Biden didn't participate in the primaries, and neither did Hillary Clinton, but Hillary Clinton had the heavy hand of Barack Obama helping her get that nomination. Jim Clyburn stopped the clock, if you will. I don't think it's a given that Biden wins that nomination.
Well, COVID stops the
Right.
campaign.
COVID, there's no doubt, COVID and Clyburn, 2 Cs there. And of course, Harris was sort of anointed into this. I think I wouldn't underestimate that when there's truly this open sort of process, that you were going to see new voices. I mean, look, it's not lost on me that 2 of the most interesting Democratic victors or actually one was a loser and one was a winner, both were auto mechanics. Dan Osborne in Nebraska, don't call him a Democrat, Dan Osborne, and Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, who has held a seat in Washington State that's been a Republican seat. But look, Republicans have had the wrong type of Republican nominated each time that she's won. So
Joe Kent.
But the way they have figured out how to talk with voters rather than talk to voters, I think is. My point is, I think you're going to see that the party needs 1,000 flowers to bloom here for a cycle or two, to sort of get. They just need, they need to plant new seeds and they need new crops to grow. Those crops are candidates.
This is slightly trollish, but to Brendan's argument, I would say that it sounds appealing, this idea of introspection and change. But it does seem like the lesson of both 2020 and 2024 is that the party that wins the election is the party that's in denial about having lost the last one.
Touche.
Anita, I'd be particularly interested in what you think about this, but others as well. I think about a parallel moment in 1980. Reagan wins, much bigger victory than was expected, takes the Senate, Republicans pick up huge ground in the House, and there's this moment of shock and then reappraisal. And in that case, a lot of it was ideological. Did we fail because we didn't go far enough left in the Ted Kennedy direction, or should we go to the center? And it took 12 years for Democrats to figure out the answer to that question was go to the center with Bill Clinton. Is this about ideology again, and is that same kind of conversation inevitably now going to happen?
So, Jerry, I think that it is less about ideology right now, and I think it is far more about, the party kind of finding a way to not see people as members of groups, but to actually see them as part of a broader public. And Brendan mentioned this. If you look at Donald Trump's race, he actually did not spend a lot of time referring to people as in terms of the groups they were in. He does a little of that. But I think that it's more a way of approaching the electorate. So it's a little what Chuck was talking about is, people who can talk with voters. But it's also, I think, an orientation that is very much around not seeing politics as much as a transaction. Here's the tax break I'm giving you. Here's the thing I'm giving you. And starting to actually build a community around shared values again, which is, I think, part of what we're losing right now. The other thing that I think is interesting coming out of this discussion, though, if you listen carefully, is that we need to start thinking about voters in a much broader sense, as opposed to the voters who voted for us last time or that we think have a propensity. I'm struck by how much Alex has spoken about low propensity voters. I'm struck very much, as we've seen now for 3 elections, how Donald Trump brings people to vote that none of us are tracking, none of us have been in contact with, right? And so I think that one of the challenges for the Democratic Party is going to be, how do you broaden this conversation out? How do you go engage with people in places we're not doing that well with right anymore? And I think that as we look at this, it is less kind of Bill Clinton versus, the left, whatever. I think it is far more a kind of broader orientation, and it is generational. It is just generational here. So,
I want to highlight something Jonah Goldberg wrote about Kamala Harris, and it triggered something. He said, sometimes she sounded too much like a college president. And Donald Trump says nonsense, and it's perfectly understandable. And I mean that.
Yeah.
No, I don't. I'm not trying to mock it. Like the way, in some ways, he may speak, but you get what he's saying. And if you actually look at our losing presidential candidates of the last 30 years, the one who sounds more like the college president loses. Mitt Romney, John Kerry, Al Gore, Hillary Clinton, right? And what did Bill Clinton? I do think language here matters a little bit. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, Joe Biden too. They knew how to speak American, I call it. And, Obama would get mocked for dropping his G's. That was smart to drop your G's when you're starting to talk about, Bill Clinton was Bubba.
Yeah.
Right? So there is something about it. And Donald Trump, speaks a common language to the people he's talking to. And the more mocking us college president types do of it, in some ways, it only reinforces it. So, I don't want to say it's all language or all, but there's something to this, which is why the perception of the party only got more negatively reinforced when they anointed candidates, right? It all felt like it was the elites making this decision for you, right? And it just, a voter isn't going to tell you that's why they couldn't connect, but I think you can see that that's why they didn't connect.
I think a problem for Democrats, though, is that that's their coalition. And it's it's hard to be the anti-institutional party when you're the party of the people who trust institutions. And, it's just not going to be believable on some level.
Well,
Yeah,
that's why the pardon is so bad. Sorry. It totally blows up the institutional argument.
Well, I mean, setting that aside, I do think.
Sorry, I know. I know, a little too close. Sorry, about the pardon.
I have thought about this, Molly, so much in the election and in the aftermath of the election. How are you the party of building up rather than tearing down? And I mean that in institutional sense. Donald Trump is a tear it down candidate. And not everyone in his party is. And I think that's why he outperforms his party. But he is tear it down. Democrats tend to be build it up, and the government can fix it, and programs will fix it, and all of that. And how do you not create cynicism, or how do you not sort of just try to match where Republicans go on that to win elections? And I actually think it's doable. There are lots of institutions that Democrats believe are broken and flawed and in need of fixing. And I think that in some ways, Barack Obama was great at challenging the norms and the way things were going and the way people felt in the country without then saying, let's rip apart all of our norms. I think that there's sort of a difference between calling out and relating to cynicism to make a change of what is broken and just sort of matching Trump with let's tear it all down. And I think you need the right candidate to do it. And I think that the difference between Obama and Trump is very small in that fundamental regard, which was he came out and said, this is bad, we are frustrated. He was more a believer in we can fix it. Donald Trump is this is bad, this is broken, and I mean, I can fix it. It's a very different sort of solution-oriented piece, but I think that there are ways Democrats can do it because we do have a lot of problems with institutional flaws, and Republicans are believers in certain institutions and not others, but you do just have to have the candidate who wears that jacket. I mean, Donald Trump has lots of imitators and they fall completely down on their face. Barack Obama, lots of imitators. They can't capture that. And so I think as much as we want to sort of diagnose, and I think part of the reason the introspection is difficult is the people who are out there executing the message. We don't just print Coca-Cola labels on everything and then it's the same thing in every can. These are different people and they're going to fit and work with different, others. So as much as we can write a memo that says appeal to Latino voters, Donald Trump does the exact opposite and it appeals to Latino voters. But if anybody else were to try that, it wouldn't work. And so I think therein lies the challenge of the academic exercise of how do we rebrand. I think we have to take the lessons and then you do have to have the right candidates and they have to meet that moment. And I think that's just fundamentally at the root of all of this.
And so much of this is fixable with the right
Right.
candidate at the right moment,
Yes.
right? I mean, look, Democrats for a half century have won the White House when they have an outsider candidate who's running to clean up a Republican mess. The only exception is Joe Biden. I would argue a fairly anomalous year because of COVID, and he won narrowly. Obviously, Joe Biden was not an outsider, but Carter, Clinton, and Obama all have the same profile, running in really down times for the Republican Party, and they're outsiders vowing to clean up the Republican mess. And I think that's the scenario for 2028 is just you find somebody that's new. Keep in mind, by the way, 2028 will be the first time in 44 years that you did not have a Clinton or a Biden running or looming over the campaign. So this is a clean break for the party, and they're going to find somebody new that's not Clinton or Biden. And even in 2000 and 2004, the Clintons were still effectively in charge of the Democratic Party. So those are two families going back for a long time, and I think that that's the best. That's the best comeback strategy. The best strategy for reform is always the other guy screw up. It's always the other guy screw up.
Well, you just said overreach, which leads to the last question I wanted to ask, which is, what does Donald Trump, what do the Republicans have a mandate to do, and what is beyond the mandate that they just got in a very weird and close election?
Well, I think the mandate on the border actually is, in that sense, if they don't make significant progress, that's a huge fault line. I would argue that's almost like, it's almost the equivalent of when Barack Obama said, I'm going to sign a health care law by the end of my first term, right? It is so declarative on the border. So whatever this looks like to the public, meaning they've got to think that's significant. Everything else, I think, is much lower down the chain, and I think the question is overreach. I think the biggest red flag they have is this relationship they have with the wealthiest crypto people. Like, if you want to ask me what's going to be the Achilles heel of this administration, it's the obsession over making crypto happen. And I just think it's a potential financial disaster. And if that is as bad as some people fear that it could be, but just the idea that this whole thing is about creating wealth for a bunch of people who already have wealth, I just think it's a hugely, that if you were to say, what could hand the working class vote right back to the left? It's the small group of folks who have helped Trump, who are obsessed with sort of making crypto seem like a legitimate currency and financial investment.
If you subscribe to Chuck's view that he expressed earlier about we just vote against, we don't vote for, then he doesn't have a mandate. No president really recently has a mandate. I do agree that immigration, fixing the border would be popular, and that would be good for him. But I think he needs to be very careful about how he executes this deportation program. Like, that could go sideways really fast if it's much more aggressive than the public can tolerate. So this is why we kick people out every midterm because they don't actually have mandates. They just start doing stuff. And that's just how it has been for a long time, and I expect that's how it will go this time.
Can I ask a fast question of Anita? Because you've seen a few of these campaigns. Do you think that the Dem nominee in 2028 is somebody that is on the list that we could all recite in our sleep, or is it somebody else we're not talking about?
I don't know. I'm just going to be honest. I don't know. But I think that there are people that we're not talking about who potentially could run and be very credible, because I think that if you think through everything that's been discussed on this panel, voters are going to be looking for someone, and this is voters, not necessarily insiders, right?
Wise guys.
Right? But they're going to be looking for somebody who's very authentic, who they feel engages with them in a very real way, who understands their life experiences, who's on their side, who's a fighter, who's tough. And they're going to be looking for someone who does not sound like a normal politician, And right now we have a bunch of very skilled politicians who are running. And then we have some people who sound a little different, who are thinking about running. So I think it'll be quite interesting to see how it plays out. But I am, often at the end of the day, the institutional person can bring so much weight to the process that they win. We saw that in 2004. We've seen this over and over again. And then sometimes that doesn't happen, as was the case in 2008. So, so I think that it is way early, as always, Jonathan, to be handicapping this, but I think that there are people that are not on the list right now who will end up being interesting candidates. So,
I would really like to hear Alex on this question of the view from Trump world about what the mandate is for
Yes.
and what. But first, I can't resist just a little story. After Trump won in 2016, he immediately started going out and doing rallies again, which was really weird. So I went to, I think the first one was was asking people this question, like, what do you think Trump has to do to earn your continued support? And this one guy said, well, he did say he was going to build the wall and make Mexico pay for it, so he definitely has to do that. But then, of course, if he can't get it done for some reason, I would understand. And that certainly proved true. But so what do you think the mandate is for?
Yeah, well, first, I mean, there's no denying that President Trump learned a lot in his first term. There's just no way you can't not learn, right? But in doing so, I mean, he does understand where the levers are. I think he said very clearly on day one that he wants to secure the border, whether that's done by executive order, whether that's done by legislation. I think a combination, all of the above, and obviously, again, the economy, inflation. So taking measures to try to lower inflation, whether that's through permitting reform, making sure that we're increasing energy production, domestic energy production. He just yesterday said that he wants to reshore manufacturing to the United States. So again, that means permitting reform through the EPA. He's been very clear that particularly when it comes to the economy and the flip side of that, inflation, but again, securing the border, that's a day one priority.
Okay. We're going to go to questions from our audience in just a moment, but I do have one final question I'd love to get everybody's thoughts on. The narrative on the president-elect coming into this election was that he won the 2016 election against a flawed candidate, that in 2020 he became the first president since Hoover to lose the White House, the Senate, and the House, and then his candidates failed very poorly in 2022. Against that backdrop and that narrative, how significant is his comeback? Historically significant.
It's only happened one other time, right?
I was going to say, Grover Cleveland would have an answer for that, I guess.
But my whole point is I actually think the era matters a lot. I've been obsessed with this period, both periods of the pre-Civil War period. We had 7 presidencies in 28 years between Jackson and Lincoln. And then between Grant and McKinley, we had 5 one-term presidencies, including the 2 Grover Cleveland presidencies. So in some ways, I think it's more emblematic. Yes, it's his comeback, but it's more emblematic of just sort of going back to this electorate. We are in a change. We've had only 2012 and 2004 are the only 2 elections this century where nothing flipped, the House, the Senate, or the White House. It is the norm. You go back to the first, last 30 years of the last 50 years, basically post World War II to 9/11, and we didn't have any of that kind of constant change. So, 40 years of one party controlling the House. So I just think we're in yes, his comeback is historic, but I think 50 years from now, the era's more historic than the individuals. Just like I think we forget how this works. At the time, I think Grover Cleveland was thought of as a bigger deal in the moment. Now the era is a bigger deal. I think over time, this uncertainty of the 21st century, and I have this whole larger theory that this Trump realignment actually began right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And if you think about it, Trump 1.0 was Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot. And in many ways, that was actually the early warning signs of what was coming.
And Sarah Palin.
And what was coming back in '92. So I just think this era is going to end up mattering more. I think the comeback absolutely deserves kudos and all of those things. I just think what will matter more is the era we're living in 50 years from now.
I think Trump deserves a huge amount of credit for having the imagination to believe that this was possible. because it is, and you know, I don't believe in history. I was an English major, but you know, it's very easy to look at history, which is a small sample size when it comes to presidential elections, and say, well, this can't be done because it's never been done before, or it's only happened this one time. And Trump didn't take that for an answer. He said, no, I you know, believe that it's possible because I believe that I can do it. So I think he deserves a tremendous amount of credit for having come back against tremendous odds.
Mostly, I think, as it relates to winning the primary. What's remarkable about him is the absolute stranglehold he has, and that's been said many, many times. I do think that, you know, with all of the things we've talked about, how unhappy people were and inflation, that, you know, and Nikki Haley probably could have won this election, who knows. But what's remarkable about him is the loyalty that he has amongst such a massive number of people. I don't know that I've ever seen anything like that. And that is really what has endured here in a way that allowed this to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some questions from the audience. Question number one from Will, who was a student who worked with me here. Do Democrats have a message clarity problem? Since Obama 2008, Hope and Change, it's hard to recall a clear message from a Democratic campaign. They often seem to get caught up in their own language. Trump's basic language seems to come across more clearly with the Republic. Is this exacerbated by two media-averse candidates? Molly, I'll make you start.
Okay. A lot to unpack on that. Yeah. Sure. I mean, I think we point to the heads of party here rather than individual candidates. And again, I will go back to, I think we have candidates in our party, either Senate, governors, members of Congress, who are great and clear communicators. Trump is an excellent communicator of what he means. Do you know, like, he may not use the words, as Chuck said, but he is very good at communicating what he means, and people get that. And I think Barack Obama, in very different ways, was very good. And I think sometimes we shorthand a slogan for voters understanding what the candidates' values are and what they mean and what they're going to do. And I think we're looking at two candidates. You know, I think that is an oversimplification of the party writ large. And so I think we do, though, have a communication challenge. And I think that communication challenge is answering voters' concerns with policies, as Anita mentioned. I think saying, I will fix it, instead of I hear you, is a very different thing for voters. They want to be heard. They want you to understand. And I think we don't have a message problem as much as we have an ability to sort of meet people on an emotional level. But then I don't think we have media-averse candidates. I know that's been a lot of the discourse after this campaign. I do think that Republicans this cycle and in general have done a better job of capitalizing on a fractured media environment and having a presence in places where political conversations are not happening. And they talk and engage with voters about culture issues and going to MMA fights where there's no political discourse, but it is I see your culture, I relate to your culture, I appreciate your culture. And I think you can say the same for just this online discourse. And I don't think Democrats really are competitive there. And I think we have a much smaller echo chamber of people just agreeing with each other all the time, but we are not talking to people who have no interest in a political conversation, because I don't think it is a one-liner message that tells voters what you stand for. As much as Hope and Change is, pithy and it works, it was that voters understood what that meant. They felt it because we were having a better conversation with them. And so I sort of reject some of the premise of the question in sloganing or like succinct message for a party writ large, but I completely acknowledge and agree that we have a communication challenge about how we see voters and how we relate to them, and honestly, where we relate to them, because we're just not talking to them where they are.
But this goes back to the authenticity argument, I think, although I will add that when we fight, we win maybe didn't really get the people going. Maybe not as much, by the way, as we're not going back, which wasn't an official slogan at all. It was when we fight, we win, and they changed it to when we vote, we win. But I think this goes back to the authenticity argument, because when you tune into a Donald Trump rally, it's like anything can happen, right? You, as a reporter, you have to be watching it. Like, you can't skip a Donald Trump rally and then just think, okay, maybe I'll catch up to it later because anything can happen. Whereas with the traditional stump speech for a politician, you can skip a rally here or there, an event here and there, and it's it's probably going to be the same thing. So you're probably fine. Whereas when we talk about Trump, right, it was just something new and something different all the time. It really did connect with people. I covered Trump's first presidency, and there were times where you'd be talking to people in the audience, and you would hear him on stage, and I mean, it's not as if he's out there talking to people in the audience, but he really had the pulse, though, of how people were feeling about things, and he managed to really tap into that. And when it comes to connecting with people, I mean, there's multiple ways that you can do it. That's how he did it. Of course, retail politics is another way that other candidates do that, by having the one-on-one conversations with people rather than the big rallies. So I don't think there's any one way that you have to do that as a candidate, although certainly the way that Trump has done it with the rallies is one of those ways.
Okay, I have another question from our audience, from Mr. C. Malcolm Elbentz. If you look at moderates of both parties, do you think that moving toward Trump was a vote against ideology that they felt was critical of their values? What roles do elites have in alienating moderates and rural voters?
It's a pretty loaded question.
Yeah.
I guess it all depends on what your definition of who the elites are. I will say this, and I'm going to say something that's a little offbeat here, but it is. I think the problem that losing politicians have is the same problem we in the media industry have, is we're not local enough. And I think, and it's sort of obviously we have a local news problem, but it gets at the fact that we cover politics too much from a national lens, constantly. And so I just don't think we have enough reporting from rural America by rural reporters. So I think that's what creates the perception that's been exploited by those that want to create this narrative about so-called elites, who, whatever the definition of that is, right? One person's elite is another person's ally, and it's sort of like it's always funny, like somebody asked me, like, do the Democrats have too many celebrities endorsing them? And I'm like, well, what's Hulk Hogan and Joe Rogan, right? It's just, each party has different types of celebrities, each party has different types of elites. Right. I think it's fair to say the current sort of legacy elites are the ones that I think have the disconnect issue right now, and we in so-called legacy media and mainstream media sort of in many ways embody that, but part of that is because we've lost all of our local allies.
Rural voters these days are not moderate. They are pretty conservative. And that's been a very long-term phenomenon in terms of the movement to the right. And a lot of moderates have moved into the Democratic Party, self-described ideological moderates. The Democrats, in terms of how their voting coalition describes themselves, is far more composed of people who call themselves moderates, whereas the Republican Party is dominated by self-described conservatives, which are a much larger portion of the electorate than liberals are. But I really think that the realignment we are talking about is not only a demographic realignment, it is an ideological realignment. And the populist platform that Trump has used to take over and re-engineer the ideology of the Republican Party needs to be taken more seriously. And I think candidates who will be successful in the future will innovate ideologically in the way that they present what they believe in and their platform to voters.
Just a quick addition. The question referred to values, and I wonder if that's a reference to transgender, anti-transgender ads that got so much attention, and how big a factor was that? I mean, that may be part of what the questioner is getting at. Did it matter? Did people vote on cultural?
I think it's less about values and more about priorities. What do the voters prioritize?
Yeah.
I don't think I mean, I would love to hear what Molly has to say. I don't think that the transgender ads, if they were effective, were because people like prioritize transgender issues. I think it spoke to like a window into sort of the priorities, like what is your ideology, what is your mindset. It just sort of confirmed the sort of worst fears about liberals and their priorities and all of the different identity groups that they're tending to instead of you. And that was ultimately, I think, what it was about.
Isn't it a 1% issue? And that's the problem, right? The trans population is 1%. And I think what Democrats may have missed on the attack, it was not about attacking trans people. It was about going to your priorities point, which is they're obsessed over a 1% problem. I'm part of the 99% problem.
Yeah. Well, but they're not obsessed. And this is what drives Democrats crazy, understandably, is like, we spend so much time developing a housing plan, and like, we don't think about the trans stuff for 10 seconds, and we get tagged as being obsessed with it, right? And it's deeply frustrating, and I think understandably for them. But life's not fair, and you got to accept that, and you got to fight back against it, and you got to inoculate yourself because of it. She was a black woman from California, the Bay Area to be exact, who was, of course, was going to be attacked and perceived as a liberal. You've got to come to terms with that, and you've got to inoculate that and go above and beyond to prove that you're not the caricature. And I think she failed in not going far enough to rebut that claim, which was so predictable that's how Trump was going to.
San Francisco liberal, right?
San Francisco
They've been doing it for 50
liberal.
years. By the way, it's not lost on me that the Democrats have lost the popular vote 3 times since 1988.
Boston.
Twice it's
There
Bostonians,
you go.
right, that had the liberal reputation, and once it's a San Francisco Democrat.
To bring this back to
it's a branding issue.
To bring this
with
back
those
to
two.
bring this back to elites. How did this happen in the first place? There was, I guess, a questionnaire by the ACLU asking this totally ridiculous sort of edge case of if there were
And she
illegal
answered it.
immigrants
Yeah,
in
right.
prison, would you use
she did the
taxpayer
right
dollars?
thing.
Yeah, there was the video.
And
of it,
she
too.
said
Yeah.
yes. And
The
so
video, yeah.
there's I'm sure you
Don't
guys,
answer questionnaires, right? Isn't that the real, right? Never answer a questionnaire.
the fact that
policy
she
to
felt
have.
pressured
It's
from the
Apple
groups
Factory. It's an
to say
Apple
yes to
Successful
that.
former 2-term governor of Kansas just agreed with that. by the way.
But
Down with questionnaires.
somebody, and I know who it is in the Trump campaign, got a nice bonus for finding that clip, I think.
I have one final question I want to go to, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't come up with the idea to ask this earlier. It came from a member of our audience who's here with us today who suggested it. Secretary Clinton was nominated and lost in 16. Vice President Harris was nominated and lost in 20. I agree with Brendan that had Nikki Haley won the Republican nomination, she probably would have been elected, but she couldn't win the Republican nomination. How bad are the double standards in the way that men and women candidates are treated? And is that something that's going to change, and at what point?
If I answer for Mrs. Todd, she has a different answer than I have, but I will just leave it at that. She believes it's not going to happen in our lifetime. And I know a lot of women of a certain age who now believe that. I will go to my grave believing that Hillary Smith beats Donald Trump. I will always believe her last name was a bigger problem than her first name.
Is it going to take a Thatcher, Anita? I mean, is the first female president going to have to be right of center to play against type?
Probably.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the unfortunate reality of, well, I agree that I think that Hillary Clinton had unique vulnerabilities, that gender played in. I have long said I think sexism in the 90s against Hillary Clinton and in her ascent into the public consciousness that was very much loaded into what a first lady should be versus what she was, and that sexism played a role and chased her throughout her entire career, even as I do believe we have moved to be a better country on those things, but she bore the brunt of that. And so I think sexism played a role, but I also think she was not the right candidate for the moment. And as we've discussed, he's run the best campaign I think he's run, but Donald Trump is a unique sort of generational candidate. So the fact that we've nominated 2 women and they both went up against a generational candidate, what we are now going to do is decide that a Democratic woman cannot win. Because instead of saying 2 women went up against a generational candidate with unique circumstances, inflation, all of these things, we will be afraid for a while, I imagine. Or at least the women candidates are going to, when they do get in, because women will run, they are going to contend with that as a looming question that male candidates will not. And so, yes, this idea that women can't win is going to plague them because we are going to ask it and is going to be forefront, and we will isolate that as a factor, even though we've spent 4 hours discussing all of the historic factors and all of the uniqueness and the strategy and all of those things that we think played the largest role in Trump winning, but we will then penalize the next women who run because women have lost, and we don't penalize when men win for those losses because men have won before.
So Molly, the one thing I would add to that is that there is learning to be had from those 2 campaigns, and yes, they both ran against, a generational talent of many different kinds. And someone who'd been on TV and someone who understands the showman piece of this better than anyone in their lifetime. But there's no reason that the Democratic Party wouldn't want to take the steps to say, the next time a woman wins this nomination, can we make sure that we know exactly what we need to do
Completely.
to put her, because I think kind of both are true,
I
to be honest.
completely agree
Yeah.
with you. Completely agree
Yeah.
with you. We should not ignore it. We should not assume these things, but I think we will overcorrect in the threshold test.
As we always do.
As we always do,
As
but
we always
instead of saying, let's not overcorrect, let's learn, I think is what we need.
We're here in Kansas, a great state, not
terrific
just in
governor.
basketball, but in other ways too. And this is a state that has elected succession of women to statewide office in both parties, one of which is joining us here in the front row today, Governor Sebelius. And so I don't think it's something about values. This is obviously states firmly in the center, of the country, sort of the heartland. And I'm also reminded, being here in the Dole Institute, as I look at the pictures of Bob Dole and his war wounds, I kind of wonder if the first female president, it may not necessarily be a Thatcher center right, but it's going to have to be somebody with national security credentials
Yeah,
that
maybe
can pass
better.
the commander-in-chief test. And there's 2 women running for governor next year in Jersey and Virginia, Abigail Spanberger in Virginia and Mikey Sherrill, and they happen to be roommates, and they happen to both have national security backgrounds, and they're both in their mid-40s with long careers to go. And I just wonder if that will be the crucial inoculation for the woman who does become president, having been in the line of fire or at least served in the CIA, something like that gives them that credential.
Okay, but the state of Virginia has never elected a woman governor.
Commonwealth of
Right.
Virginia, thank you.
Right?
Yeah.
The Commonwealth of Virginia has never elected. Now, they're going to this time because it's going to be 2 women
Right.
nominees. But it is worth noting
Yes.
that Virginia never has,
Well,
and that's
The South has been behind on gender compared to the West, especially, but also the Midwest too, when it comes to statewide women. Yeah. So.
Okay. As Audrey mentioned in her introduction, we've been doing these post-election conferences for 20 years. I truly can't remember or imagine we would have had a better discussion and a better group of panelists than today. Let's thank them for a great discussion. We thank you all for coming out, and now that you know exactly what happened in the election last month, we invite you to come back to the Dole Institute in the future for other programs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was fun. Yeah.